In the winter of 1889, 34 guests checked into Mrs. Bridget Kelly's boarding house in Richmond, Virginia. Not a single one of them ever checked out. For over a century, the Richmond City Archives buried incident report number 1889-112, sealed by order of the mayor himself. The Methodist Church on Clay Street requested the records be destroyed. The police chief resigned without explanation 3 days after the investigation began. What they discovered in the basement of that boarding house defied every principle of Christian decency they thought they knew about their God-fearing community. Tonight, I'll tell you exactly what Mrs. Kelly did to those 34 souls and why the truth was too horrifying for Richmond society to bear. Before we continue with the story of Bridget Kelly and her method for disposing of unwanted guests, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the dark secrets hidden in America's past. If you're brave enough to hear the truth about what happened in that boarding house, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you ready to join the select few who know these forbidden stories? The truth about Mrs. Kelly's boarding house begins in the autumn of 1888, when Richmond's Methodist community thought they had found their perfect Christian landlady. Richmond, Virginia, in 1888, was a city rebuilding itself from the ashes of war. 23 years had passed since the Confederate capital fell, and the scars of Reconstruction were finally beginning to heal. The cobblestone streets of Church Hill echoed with the sounds of hammers and saws as new businesses opened their doors, and the sweet smell of tobacco from the warehouses mixed with the coal smoke from the James River factories. Clay Street Methodist Church stood as a beacon of moral authority in this recovering city. Reverend Thomas Whitman, a thin man with penetrating gray eyes and a voice that could shake the rafters, had built his congregation from 37 members to over 400 in just 5 years. The Methodists prided themselves on their charitable work, their temperance meetings, and their unwavering commitment to Christian values in a world that seemed increasingly godless. It was Reverend Whitman himself who recommended Mrs. Bridget Kelly when the congregation sought a respectable boarding house for visiting ministers, traveling missionaries, and faithful church members seeking temporary lodging. Mrs. Kelly, a widow in her middle years, with steel-grey hair, always pulled back in a severe bun, had approached the Reverend with a proposal that seemed heaven-sent. "Reverend," she had said, her Irish accent softened by decades in Virginia, "I've inherited my late husband's property on Marshall Street. It's a fine 3-story house with 12 rooms. I wish to open it as a Christian boarding house, a place where godly folks can stay without fear of corruption or sin." The house at 1247 Marshall Street was indeed impressive, built in 1854 by a tobacco merchant who had fled north during the war. It featured tall windows, ornate woodwork, and a wraparound porch that suggested prosperity and respectability. The basement had been converted into a kitchen and storage area with stone walls that would keep food cool in summer and warm in winter. Mrs. Kelly's references were impeccable. She had served as housekeeper for the Episcopal rector in Lynchburg for 15 years. She attended services twice weekly, contributed regularly to the poor box, and could recite scripture with the fluency of a seminary graduate. Her personal tragedy, the loss of her husband, Patrick, to consumption and her only son, Michael, to a railroad accident, had only deepened her faith and her desire to serve others. The Methodist community embraced her with open arms. Church ladies brought her pies and quilts. The men's auxiliary helped her move furniture and repair the front steps. Reverend Whitman himself blessed the house in a ceremony attended by half the congregation, sprinkling holy water in every room, while Mrs. Kelly followed behind, her head bowed in apparent devotion. "Lord," the Reverend had prayed in the front parlor, "let this house be a sanctuary for your faithful servants. Let it be a place of rest for the weary traveler and comfort for the lonely soul." Mrs. Kelly had whispered amen so fervently that tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. The first guests arrived in November 1888. Brother Jonathan Pierce, a circuit preacher from the Blue Ridge Mountains, needed lodging while he recovered from a bout of pneumonia. Sarah Henderson, a missionary's widow returning from China, required a place to stay while she arranged her late husband's affairs. A traveling gospel singer named Thomas Bright took a room for a week while he performed at various churches throughout the city. All three praised Mrs. Kelly's hospitality. The meals were generous, the rooms were clean, and the nightly Bible readings in the parlor were both inspirational and comforting. Mrs. Kelly seemed to anticipate her guests' every need, appearing with hot tea when they felt poorly, with extra blankets when the November chill crept through the windows, with gentle words of scripture when they felt homesick or discouraged. She's like a mother to us all. Brother Pierce wrote to his wife in Roanoke, "The Lord has blessed us with a true Christian woman." By Christmas of 1888, word of Mrs. Kelly's boarding house had spread throughout the Methodist network in Virginia. Visiting ministers began requesting rooms specifically at 1247 Marshall Street. Traveling evangelists made it their regular stop. Church members from the countryside who needed to visit Richmond for business or medical care sought out Mrs. Kelly's Christian hospitality. The house was rarely empty. Mrs. Kelly had a gift for making everyone feel welcome, for remembering their favorite foods, their family troubles, their spiritual struggles. She would sit with guests who couldn't sleep, pray with those who felt burdened, and offer practical advice to those facing difficult decisions. But there was something else about Mrs. Kelly's boarding house that set it apart from other lodging establishments in Richmond, something that should have raised questions, but somehow never did. Her guests were remarkably loyal. They returned again and again, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. They spoke of Mrs. Kelly with an almost religious devotion that went beyond mere gratitude for good service, and they seemed to develop an unusual attachment to the house itself, as if leaving it caused them genuine distress. "I feel such peace here," wrote Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a church organist from Norfolk who had been staying at the boarding house for 2 months. "It's as if the Lord himself has blessed this place with his presence. I cannot bear the thought of leaving." Mrs. Kelly would smile, her gentle smile, and pat her guests' hands. "This is your home now, dear," she would say. "Stay as long as the Lord provides." And they did stay, through the winter of 1889, through the spring, through the long, humid summer. Some guests, who had originally planned to visit for a few days, extended their stays to weeks, then months. They wrote fewer letters home. They spoke less of their outside obligations. They seemed to find everything they needed within the walls of Mrs. Kelly's boarding house. The Methodist community saw this as a testament to Mrs. Kelly's Christian hospitality. Reverend Whitman held her up as an example of godly service during his Sunday sermons. The church ladies organized a quilting circle to make bedding for her constantly occupied rooms. The men's auxiliary donated furniture and helped with repairs. No one questioned why Mrs. Kelly's guests seemed to lose interest in the outside world. No one wondered why their letters home became less frequent, then stopped altogether. No one asked why visiting family members were politely turned away with explanations that their loved ones were resting or in prayer or too unwell for visitors. It was a time when Christian charity was valued above curiosity, when respect for privacy was considered a virtue, and when the word of a respectable church member was beyond question. That trust would prove to be fatal. The first crack in Mrs. Kelly's carefully constructed facade appeared on a frigid January morning in 1889. Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, a church organist from Petersburg, had been staying at the boarding house for nearly 2 months. Her sister Emma, who lived in Richmond, had been growing increasingly concerned about Dorothy's failure to visit or even send word about her well-being. Emma Ashford was not a woman easily dismissed, a schoolteacher with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak. She had been attempting to visit her sister for 3 weeks, only to be turned away each time by Mrs. Kelly with increasingly elaborate explanations. "Your sister is deep in prayer and contemplation," Mrs. Kelly had said during Emma's first visit in early January. "She's asked not to be disturbed while she seeks the Lord's guidance about her future." A week later, the excuse had changed. "Poor Dorothy has taken ill with a terrible cough. The doctor says she mustn't have visitors for fear of spreading the infection." By the 3rd week, Mrs. Kelly's explanations had become more creative still. "Dorothy is helping me with a special project for the church. She's working day and night to finish it before the revival meeting. She simply cannot spare the time for social calls." Emma's patience finally snapped on the 28th of January, 1889. She arrived at the boarding house at 7 the morning before Mrs. Kelly had time to prepare her usual deflections. The older woman answered the door in her nightgown, her steel grey hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes sharp and alert despite the early hour. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, her Irish accent thicker than usual. "This is most irregular. Christian ladies don't call at such hours. Christian ladies don't keep sisters from seeing each other for weeks on end," Emma replied, pushing past Mrs. Kelly into the front hall. "I'm going to see Dorothy now, and I won't be turned away again." The house was strangely quiet for a boarding establishment that allegedly housed a dozen guests. No footsteps overhead, no voices from the dining room, no sounds of morning activities. Even the normal creaking and settling of an old house seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "Dorothy's room is on the 3rd floor, Emma said, starting toward the staircase. "I remember you mentioning it last week." "Mrs." Kelly's hand shot out and gripped Emma's wrist with surprising strength. "You cannot go up there. The other guests are still sleeping. It would be most improper." For a moment, the two women stood frozen in the hallway, Mrs. Kelly's fingers digging into Emma's arm, her eyes boring into the younger woman's face with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Then Emma yanked her arm free and ran up the stairs, calling her sister's name. "Dorothy, Dorothy, it's Emma. Where are you?" The second-floor hallway was lined with doors, all closed, all silent. Emma knocked on each one, calling out, but received no response. The air smelled stale and heavy, with an underlying odor that she couldn't identify. Something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Behind her, Mrs. Kelly's footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs, slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Ashford," she called in a voice that had lost all pretense of Christian kindness. "You must leave immediately. This is a private residence, and you are trespassing." Emma reached the 3rd floor, her heart pounding. The smell was stronger here, almost overwhelming. She tried the first door she came to locked, the second also locked. Every door on the 3rd floor was secured from the outside. "Dorothy," she screamed, pounding on the doors. "Dorothy, answer me." From behind one of the doors came a sound that made Emma's blood run cold. Not a voice, exactly, but something between a moan and a whimper, so faint it might have been her imagination. She pressed her ear to the door and heard it again, a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone trying to speak, but unable to form words. Mrs. Kelly reached the 3rd-floor landing, and Emma saw that the older woman was carrying something in her hand, a small brown bottle with a cork stopper, the kind used for medicinal tonics. "You need to leave, Mrs." Kelly said again, her voice now completely devoid of emotion. "You need to leave and never come back." Emma backed away from the door, her eyes fixed on the bottle. "What have you done to my sister? What have you done to Dorothy?" "Your sister is at peace," Mrs. Kelly replied. "She has found the rest she was seeking. They all have." The way she said, "they all," made Emma's knees weak. She thought of all the guests Mrs. Kelly had mentioned over the months. Brother Pierce, Mrs. Henderson, Thomas Bright, and so many others. Guests who had extended their stays indefinitely, who had stopped writing to their families, who had seemingly vanished from the world outside this house. "You're insane," Emma whispered. Mrs. Kelly smiled, and for the first time, Emma saw her true face. Not the gentle maternal expression she wore in church, but something cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. "I'm devoted," she said. "I'm giving them what they all truly wanted. Eternal peace in the Lord's embrace. No more worldly worries. No more earthly suffering. Just blessed eternal rest." Emma turned and ran. She flew down the stairs, through the hallway, and out the front door into the bitter January morning. She ran 6 blocks to the Richmond police station, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain what she had witnessed. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named O'Brien, listened to her story with growing skepticism. Mrs. Kelly, the sweet Irish widow who ran the Christian boarding house, the woman who brought cookies to the police station every Christmas. "Now, miss," he said in a patronizing tone, "I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Maybe your sister just needs some time to herself. Maybe she's going through a difficult period and doesn't want visitors." But Emma was persistent. and her story was specific enough to be troubling. After an hour of her increasingly frantic pleading, Sergeant O'Brien agreed to accompany her back to the boarding house to check on Dorothy's welfare. They arrived at 1247 Marshall Street to find Mrs. Kelly waiting for them on the front porch, fully dressed now in her usual black dress and white apron. She had prepared tea and cookies, which she offered to the sergeant with her customary smile. "Officer O'Brien," she said warmly, "what a pleasant surprise, though I must say, I'm concerned about young Mrs. Ashford here. She seems to be having some sort of nervous episode." Emma started to protest, but Mrs. Kelly continued smoothly. "Her sister Dorothy left early this morning, I'm afraid. She received word that her church in Petersburg needed her immediately. Some crisis with the organ or the choir, I believe. She was quite distressed about leaving without saying goodbye, but she asked me to give Emma her love and to tell her she would write soon." The sergeant nodded, clearly relieved to have a rational explanation. "There you have it, miss. Your sister's gone back to Petersburg. Nothing sinister about it." "That's impossible," Emma insisted. "I heard her upstairs. She was locked in one of those rooms." Mrs. Kelly's expression became sympathetic and concerned. "Oh, my dear child, I'm afraid you're mistaken. All of my guest rooms are empty at the moment. Would you like Officer O'Brien to take a look? I have nothing to hide." She led them through the house room by room. The second and third floors were indeed empty, the beds neatly made, the windows open to air out the rooms. There was no sign of Dorothy or any other guests. The strange smell Emma had noticed earlier was gone, replaced by the clean scent of lye soap and fresh linens. "You see, Mrs. Kelly said gently, poor Emma must have been so worried about her sister that she imagined things. It happens sometimes, especially to unmarried women of a certain age. The strain of spinsterhood can be quite taxing on the feminine mind." Sergeant O'Brien escorted Emma from the house, muttering about hysterical females and wasted time. As they walked down Marshall Street, Emma looked back to see Mrs. Kelly watching from an upstairs window, her face a mask of benevolent concern. But Emma knew what she had seen. She knew what she had heard. And she knew that her sister Dorothy was still somewhere in that house. Whether Mrs. Kelly wanted to admit it or not, the question was, what was she going to do about it? Emma Ashford's accusations against Mrs. Kelly should have been the end of the matter. A hysterical spinster, imagining things, a simple misunderstanding, a false alarm that wasted police time. But Emma was not the type of woman to give up easily, and her persistent questions began to stir uncomfortable memories in the minds of Richmond's Methodist community. Mrs. Sarah Patterson, whose brother-in-law had been staying at Mrs. Kelly's boarding house since October, mentioned to her husband over dinner that she hadn't received a letter from Charles in nearly 2 months. "That's not like him," she said, stirring her soup absently. "He writes every week, regular as clockwork." Reverend Whitman found himself thinking about the various ministers and missionaries who had stayed at the boarding house over the past year. How many of them had simply disappeared from correspondence? How many had failed to arrive at their next appointments, leaving churches and mission societies wondering about their whereabouts? The more he thought about it, the more troubling the pattern became. Brother Pierce, the circuit preacher who had been recovering from pneumonia, had never returned to his circuit. His wife in Roanoke had written to the Richmond church 3 times, asking if anyone had news of her husband. Mrs. Henderson, the missionar's widow, had missed her planned departure for her sister's home in Baltimore. Thomas Bright, the gospel singer, had failed to appear for a scheduled performance in Norfolk. Each disappearance had been explained away at the time. People changed their plans. After all, they found new opportunities, new callings, new directions for their lives. In a society where communication was slow and uncertain, where a letter might take weeks to arrive, where people regularly moved across vast distances in search of work or family, it was not unusual for someone to simply vanish from their former circles. But taken together, the disappearances formed a pattern that was beginning to concern those who looked closely enough to see it. Dr. Marcus Webb, the physician who served several churches in the Richmond area, had been treating guests at Mrs. Kelly's boarding house for months. They came to him with complaints of fatigue, confusion, and memory problems. "I can't seem to think clearly," they would tell him. "I feel so tired all the time and I have the strangest dreams." At first, Dr. Webb attributed these symptoms to the stress of travel, the change in diet and routine that came with staying in unfamiliar lodgings. He prescribed rest, fresh air, and tonics to restore their strength. But as more and more of Mrs. Kelly's guests came to him with identical complaints, he began to suspect something more sinister. The symptoms were consistent with certain types of poisoning, not enough to kill, but enough to cause confusion and lethargy. Laudanum perhaps, or some other opiate, given in small, regular doses. It could keep a person in a state of docile compliance for months. But why would Mrs. Kelly want to drug her guests? What possible benefit could she derive from keeping them in a semi-conscious state? The answer, Dr. Webb realized with growing horror, was simple money. Each guest at the boarding house paid weekly rent in advance. They also paid for their meals, their laundry, and various incidental expenses. A typical guest might pay $8 to $10 per week for room and board, a substantial sum in 1889, equivalent to several months' wages for a working man. If Mrs. Kelly could keep her guests in a state where they were alive, but unable to make rational decisions, unable to leave or communicate with the outside world, she could continue collecting their money indefinitely. She could forge letters to their families, make excuses for their absence, and gradually take control of their entire estates. It was a scheme that required a special kind of victim, people who traveled alone, who had few close ties to their communities, who might not be missed immediately if they disappeared. Ministers and missionaries fit this profile perfectly. They were often single, frequently traveled, and accustomed to long periods of isolation. Dr. Webb's suspicions were confirmed when he received a visit from Emma Ashford in early February. She had been investigating her sister's disappearance for 2 weeks, and her findings were deeply disturbing. "I've been to the post office," she told Dr. Webb. "Mrs. Kelly has been collecting mail for over a dozen people who are supposedly no longer staying at her boarding house. Letters from banks, from lawyers, from family members. She's been signing their names to documents, withdrawing money from their accounts, selling their possessions." Emma had also discovered that Mrs. Kelly had been corresponding with churches and mission societies across Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. She had been identifying potential victims, single ministers, widowed missionaries, traveling evangelists, and inviting them to stay at her boarding house. "She's been hunting them," Emma said, her voice shaking with anger, like a spider in a web, drawing them in. "And then what?" Dr. Webb asked, though he dreaded the answer. Emma's face was pale and drawn. "I don't think she's just keeping them drugged. Doctor, I think she's been killing them." The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Too many people had vanished without a trace. Too many letters had gone unanswered. Too many appointments had been missed, and Emma's brief glimpse into the 3rd floor of the boarding house suggested that something truly horrible was happening behind those locked doors. Dr. Webb knew he had to act. As a medical professional, he had a duty to protect his patients from harm. As a Christian, he had a moral obligation to expose evil wherever he found it. But as a practical man, he also knew that accusations against a respected member of the church community would require solid evidence. The question was, how could they get inside the boarding house long enough to find proof of Mrs. Kelly's crimes? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Kelly herself provided the opportunity they needed when she announced that she would be traveling to Norfolk for a week to attend a Christian women's conference. She asked the congregation to pray for her journey and to keep an eye on her property while she was away. "The boarding house will be empty," she explained to Reverend Whitman. "All of my guests have moved on to other accommodations. I'll be shutting the house up until I return." It was the perfect cover story. If the house was supposedly empty, no one would question the absence of sounds or activity. And if Mrs. Kelly was truly away, there would be no one to stop Dr. Webb and Emma from conducting their investigation. On the night of the 15th of February, 1889, Dr. Webb and Emma Ashford broke into 1247 Marshall Street. They brought with them a police lantern, a set of medical instruments, and a camera, one of the new portable models that could capture images in low light. What they found in the basement of Mrs. Kelly's boarding house would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The basement of 1247 Marshall Street stretched the full length of the house, its stone walls sweating with moisture despite the February cold. The web's lantern cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their source, creating an atmosphere of dread that made both investigators want to flee before they had even begun their search. Emma held her handkerchief to her nose, trying to block out the smell that had grown stronger as they descended the stairs. It was the same sweet, cloying odor she had noticed on the 3rd floor, but concentrated now, almost overwhelming in its intensity. "Dear God," Dr. Webb whispered, his medical training helping him identify the source of the smell. "Emma, I think we should know," she said firmly, though her voice shook. "We have to find out what happened to Dorothy. We have to know the truth." The basement was divided into several chambers, each serving a different purpose. The first room contained the usual household items, preserving jars, root vegetables, barrels of flour, and sugar. But it was in the second chamber that they found the first evidence of Mrs. Kelly's true activities. The room contained a makeshift laboratory of sorts, with shelves lined with bottles and jars containing various substances. Dr. Webb examined the labels, his expression growing more grim with each discovery. "Laudanum," he said, holding up a brown bottle. "Chloral hydrate. Morphine. Enough opiates to keep a dozen people in a stupor for months." Emma found a wooden box filled with letters, all addressed to guests of the boarding house. She opened one at random and began to read. "My dearest Sarah, I pray this letter finds you in good health. Your brother Charles writes to say that he has decided to extend his stay in Richmond indefinitely. He has found great peace at Mrs. Kelly's establishment and wishes to spend more time in prayer and contemplation before returning to his worldly duties." "She's been forging correspondence," Emma said, her voice tight with anger. "Look at the handwriting. It's the same on all of them." The third chamber contained Mrs. Kelly's most damning evidence, a detailed ledger documenting her financial crimes. She had been systematically stealing from her guests, forging their signatures on bank drafts, selling their possessions, and even collecting death benefits by reporting them deceased to insurance companies. But it was the fourth chamber that revealed the true horror of Mrs. Kelly's methods. The room was set up as a morgue with several wooden tables and an array of medical instruments that would have been more appropriate in a hospital than a boarding house basement. Along one wall stood a series of large metal containers, zinc-lined coffins that could be sealed hermetically. Dr. Webb opened the first container and immediately recoiled. Inside lay the body of a middle-aged man, perfectly preserved by some chemical process. His face was peaceful, almost serene, as if he had simply fallen asleep. "My God," Dr. Webb breathed. "She's been preserving them." Emma looked into the second container and let out a strangled cry. The body inside was that of a woman in her 32nd, her brown hair still neatly arranged, her hands folded across her chest in a gesture of prayer. "That's not Dorothy," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but look at her dress. It's one of Dorothy's Mrs. Kelly has been dressing them up, arranging them like dolls." They found 14 bodies in total, each one preserved with the same meticulous care. Some were recent arrivals, their features still recognizable. Others had been there longer, their skin taking on a waxy, translucent quality that made them look like religious statues. Each body was accompanied by a small placard with the person's name, their date of arrival at the boarding house, and their date of death. The dates revealed that Mrs. Kelly had been killing her guests at intervals of several weeks or months, presumably after she had extracted as much money as possible from their estates. Dr. Webb's medical examination revealed that all of the victims had died from gradual poisoning, small doses of various toxins administered over time until their bodies simply gave up the fight. It was a slow, cruel death that would have been relatively painless, but utterly inevitable. "She's been playing God," Emma said, her voice filled with horror and rage, deciding who lives and who dies, arranging their bodies like some kind of twisted religious tableau. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In the far corner of the chamber, Dr. Webb found a small wooden door that led to a fifth room. This one was different from the others, warmer, more comfortable, with a bed and a rocking chair and shelves lined with books. And in the bed, barely conscious but still alive, lay Emma's sister, Dorothy. Dorothy's eyes were open but vacant, her breathing shallow and labored. She had been dressed in a clean white gown, her hair brushed and arranged, her hands folded across her chest in imitation of the corpses in the other room. "Dorothy," Emma cried, rushing to her sister's side. "Dorothy, can you hear me?" Dorothy's eyes slowly focused on Emma's face, and for a moment, recognition flickered in their depths. Her lips moved, forming words that Emma had to strain to hear. "Emma," Dorothy whispered, Is it really you, or am I dreaming again?" Dr. Webb examined Dorothy quickly, checking her pulse and pupil response. "She's been heavily drugged," he said, "but I think she'll recover. We need to get her out of here immediately." As they helped Dorothy to her feet, Emma noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the bedside table was a small placard, just like the ones that had accompanied the bodies in the other room. It read, "Dorothy Ashford arrived the 3rd of December, 1888. Departed the 1st of March, 1889. Mrs. Kelly had been planning Dorothy's death for 2 weeks hence. She'd been keeping her alive just long enough to extract the maximum benefit from her estate. Then she would have joined the other bodies in their zinc-lined coffins. "We have to get to the police, Doctor," Webb said, supporting Dorothy as she struggled to walk. "We have to stop her before she comes back." But as they made their way toward the basement stairs, they heard a sound that made their hearts stop. The front door of the boarding house opening and closing, followed by the familiar sound of Mrs. Kelly's footsteps on the floor above. She had returned early from her trip to Norfolk, and now she knew that her secret had been discovered. The footsteps above their heads moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured and purposeful. Mrs. Kelly was not rushing, she was hunting. The floorboards creaked in a rhythm that seemed almost musical, a deadly waltz that crescendoed as she approached the basement door. Dr. Webb extinguished his lantern immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness. Emma held her breath, supporting her sister's weight as Dorothy swayed unsteadily on her feet. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, broken only by the sound of their own heartbeats and Dorothy's labored breathing. Then they heard Mrs. Kelly's voice drifting down from the kitchen above. She was humming a hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," her voice sweet and melodious, as if she were leading a church service rather than stalking intruders in her house of death. "I know you're down there," she called out in a conversational tone. "Dr. Webb, isn't it? And dear Emma Ashford, I saw your footprints in the snow outside. Such a shame. I had hoped we could resolve this matter more peacefully." The basement door creaked open, and a sliver of lamplight cut through the darkness. Mrs. Kelly's shadow appeared at the top of the stairs, elongated and distorted by the angle of the light. "You've seen my work," she continued, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine pride. 34 souls at rest, 34 spirits freed from the burdens of earthly existence. I've been doing the Lord's work. You know, these poor wandering souls came to me seeking peace, and I gave them the ultimate peace, eternal rest in the arms of Jesus. Dr. Webb motioned for Emma to take Dorothy toward the far corner of the basement, where another set of stairs led to the outside cellar doors. If they could reach those stairs without being seen, they might be able to escape before Mrs. Kelly reached the basement floor. But Dorothy was barely conscious, her legs unable to support her weight. Every step produced a shuffling sound that seemed to echo through the stone chambers, like thunder. Mrs. Kelly's humming stopped abruptly. Now, she said, her voice taking on a stern maternal quality. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Dr. Webb. As a medical man, surely you understand that what I've done is merciful. No more pain, no more suffering, no more fear of death. I've given them the gift of peace." She began descending the stairs, her lamp casting wild shadows on the walls. In the dancing light, Emma caught a glimpse of Mrs. Kelly's face. The mask of Christian benevolence had fallen away completely, revealing something cold and calculating and utterly mad. "You see, I discovered something wonderful during my first year in Richmond," Mrs. Kelly continued, her voice growing closer. "These traveling preachers, these missionaries, these lonely old church folk, they all have the same dream. They want to be taken care of, to be loved, to find a place where they can rest and be at peace. I simply gave them what they wanted." Emma and Dr. Webb had reached the far chamber, but Dorothy collapsed against the wall, unable to go any further. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and Emma realized with horror that the stress of the escape was causing her sister to overdose on whatever drugs Mrs. Kelly had been giving her. "She needs medical attention," Dr. Webb whispered. "If we don't get her to a hospital soon, and the beauty of it," Mrs. Kelly's voice continued, now echoing from the main chamber, is that they were all so grateful. Even at the end, when they realized what was happening, they thanked me. They understood that I was giving them the greatest gift of all, release from the veil of tears. Emma heard the sound of Mrs. Kelly moving through the laboratory, examining the evidence they had disturbed. Glass clinked as she straightened bottles, and paper rustled as she reorganized her correspondence files. Of course, I couldn't let them suffer. Mrs. Kelly went on, her tone becoming more conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. The Lord kept them comfortable, kept them peaceful. They would drift in and out of consciousness, dreaming such beautiful dreams. Some of them would tell me about their visions, angels, golden light, the voices of loved ones calling them home. Dr. Webb had been examining the cellar doors, but they were locked from the outside with a heavy iron bar. They were trapped in the basement with a mad woman who had already murdered 34 people and was clearly preparing to make them her next victims. Dr. Webb, Mrs. Kelly called out, her voice now coming from the second chamber. I know you're wondering about my methods. As a physician, you must appreciate the precision involved. Each guest required a different approach. You see, the dosage had to be calibrated to their size, their age, their general health. Too little, and they might recover their senses. Too much, and they would die too quickly before I could properly arrange their affairs. Emma looked around desperately for another way out. The basement windows were too small for adult bodies, and the walls were solid stone. The only way out was through the main stairs, and Mrs. Kelly was blocking that route. I kept meticulous records. Mrs. Kelly continued, and they could hear her moving closer to their hiding place. Each guest's spiritual journey, their final words, their monetary contributions to my ministry. Yes, that's what this is, a ministry. I'm called to gather God's lonely children and shepherd them to their eternal rest. The lamplight was getting brighter now, casting long shadows into their chamber. Emma could see that Dorothy's lips were turning blue, and her breathing had become irregular. Whatever drugs Mrs. Kelly had been administering were building up in her system, and the stress of their situation was pushing her toward a fatal overdose. Dorothy needs IPAC. Dr. Webb whispered urgently, something to make her vomit up whatever's still in her stomach without it. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Emma understood that her sister was dying, and they were running out of time. Mrs. Henderson was particularly peaceful. Mrs. Kelly's voice drifted from the next chamber, along with the sound of her examining the preserved bodies. She spoke of her late husband, waiting for her in paradise. Such a blessing to witness someone's transition from this world to the next. Emma made a desperate decision. She pressed Dorothy's hand and whispered, "I'll be right back," then crept toward the main chamber, where Mrs. Kelly's voice was coming from. The older woman stood with her back turned, arranging flowers around one of the zinc-lined coffins. She had changed from her traveling clothes into a white dress that made her look like some perverted angel of death. The lamp sat on a nearby table, casting her shadow enormous on the stone wall. "Ah, Emma, dear," Mrs. Kelly said without turning around. "I was wondering when you would join me. Your sister is quite ill, isn't she? The transition can be difficult for some souls. They cling to earthly existence, even when paradise awaits." Emma noticed a bottle on the table next to the lamp. IPAC syrup. Exactly what Dr. Webb had said Dorothy needed, but Mrs. Kelly stood between her and the medicine, and Emma knew she would have only one chance to reach it. "Why?" Emma asked, trying to keep Mrs. Kelly talking while she positioned herself for a rush toward the table. "Why did you kill all these people? What did they ever do to you?" Mrs. Kelly finally turned, and Emma saw that her face was streaked with tears. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of religious ecstasy, the expression of someone who believed herself to be doing God's work. "They were suffering, child," she said, a voice filled with compassion that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. Lost souls wandering in spiritual darkness, afraid of death and what lay beyond. "I showed them the way home." "You murdered them," Emma said, her voice shaking with rage. "You drugged them and killed them and stole their money. I provided for their physical needs while they prepared for their spiritual journey." Mrs. Kelly corrected gently. "The money they gave me was used to maintain this sanctuary, to care for other lost souls who would come after them. It was all part of God's plan." Behind Mrs. Kelly, Emma could see Dr. Webb emerging from the shadows, moving carefully toward the stairs. If she could keep Mrs. Kelly distracted for just a few more minutes, he might be able to reach the police. "What about Dorothy?" Emma demanded. "She has a life, a job, people who love her. You had no right to decide her fate." Mrs. Kelly's expression became sad and pitying. "Dear Dorothy came to me broken-hearted and lost. Her fiancé had died in a railroad accident 2 months before their wedding. She felt she had nothing left to live for. I simply offered her the peace she was seeking. She never told me about any fiancé," Emma said, confused. Mrs. Kelly smiled. "Oh, my dear child, there was no fiancé. Poor Dorothy was suffering from what the doctors call melancholia, a disease of the mind that made her see tragedy where none existed. She was quite mad, you know. I was simply helping her find release from her tortured thoughts." The casual revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Mrs. Kelly had been slowly poisoning Dorothy's mind along with her body, using drugs to create false memories and delusions that would justify her eventual murder. "You're the one who's mad," Emma whispered. "Am I?" Mrs. Kelly asked, stepping closer. "Look around you, child. Look at the peace on their faces. Look at the serenity in their expressions. These souls died knowing they were loved, knowing they were cared for, knowing their suffering was over. How many people can say the same about their final moments?" Emma saw her chance. Mrs. Kelly had moved far enough from the table that she could reach the Ipac bottle if she moved quickly. She lunged forward, her hand closing around the small brown bottle just as Mrs. Kelly's fingers closed around her wrist. Now, Mrs. Kelly said, her grip surprisingly strong. "That medicine isn't for your sister, dear. It's for you." Emma looked down at the bottle in her hand and realized with horror that it wasn't Epiac at all. The label read strychnine for external use only. Mrs. Kelly had been waiting for her to take it, had positioned it deliberately where Emma would grab it in desperation. "You see how cunning desperation makes us?" Mrs. Kelly said, her voice filled with gentle mockery. "You would have poisoned your own sister to save her, but I'm offering you both something much better. Peaceful rest together forever." Dr. Webb had reached the stairs, but as he climbed toward the basement door, it slammed shut above him. Emma heard the sound of a heavy bar being dropped across it from the outside. "I'm afraid Mr. Patterson is waiting upstairs," Mrs. Kelly said, noticing Emma's confusion. "Sarah's brother-in-law, you remember? He's been helping me with my ministry for several months now. The drugs affect different people in different ways. You see, some become docile and peaceful, others become useful." The realization that Mrs. Kelly had accomplices among her victims made their situation even more hopeless. Even if they could overpower the older woman, they would still have to deal with whoever was guarding the door above. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Mrs. Kelly's boarding house intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The sound of Dr. Webb pounding on the basement door echoed through the stone chambers, but it was met only by silence from above. Mrs. Kelly smiled and reached into her apron pocket, withdrawing a small vial of clear liquid. "This won't hurt," she said, moving toward Emma with the same gentle expression she might have worn while serving tea to her church ladies. "I promise you, dear child, this is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for you." Emma's hand tightened around the strychnine bottle, and in that moment of desperation, a terrible idea formed in her mind. If Mrs. Kelly expected her to drink poison, perhaps she could turn that expectation against her captor. "Wait," Emma said, backing away slowly. "If you're going to kill me anyway, at least tell me the truth. Tell me how this all started. I want to understand." Mrs. Kelly paused, the vial still in her hand. Emma could see the hunger in her eyes, the need to be understood, to be appreciated for her twisted work. It was the same need that had compelled her to preserve her victims' bodies, to arrange them like religious statues, to keep detailed records of their spiritual journeys. "You really want to know?" Mrs. Kelly asked, her voice softening with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "I do," Emma lied. "I want to understand why you think this is God's work." Mrs. Kelly set the vial down on the table and clasped her hands together, her expression becoming dreamy and distant. "It began with my Patrick," she said. My dear husband dying of consumption in that terrible hospital in Lynchburg. The doctors said there was nothing they could do, that he would suffer for months before the end came. She moved closer to one of the zinc-lined coffins, running her hand lovingly along its edge. I couldn't bear to watch him waste away, to see him in such agony. So one night, when the pain was particularly bad, I gave him extra laudanum, just a little more than the doctor prescribed, and then a little more the next night, and the next. Emma felt sick as she realized what Mrs. Kelly was confessing. You killed your own husband. I set him free. Mrs. Kelly corrected, her voice filled with gentle conviction. And when he died, his face was so peaceful, so serene. I knew then that I had done the right thing. I had given him the greatest gift possible, release from suffering. Behind Mrs. Kelly, Emma could see Dr. Webb moving quietly through the shadows. He had found something, a crowbar or some other tool, and was positioning himself for an attack. Emma needed to keep Mrs. Kelly talking just a little longer. But that doesn't explain all this, Emma said, gesturing toward the preserved bodies. Why didn't you stop with Patrick? Mrs. Kelly's expression became radiant, as if she were describing a religious vision. Because I realized that Patrick's death had been a sign from God. I had been chosen to be an angel of mercy, to help other suffering souls find their way to paradise. The lonely, the lost, the forgotten. They would come to me and I would help them home. So you opened the boarding house as a trap, Emma said, trying to keep the revulsion out of her voice. As a sanctuary, Mrs. Kelly corrected, a place where weary travelers could find rest. And if that rest became eternal, well, isn't that what we all truly desire? Freedom from the pain and uncertainty of mortal existence. Emma saw Dr. Webb raise the crowbar, preparing to strike. But Mrs. Kelly must have sensed something, because she suddenly spun around. The older woman was faster than Emma had expected, and she grabbed a heavy candlestick from the table, swinging it at Dr. Webb's head. The doctor ducked, but the candlestick caught him a glancing blow on the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. Mrs. Kelly advanced on him, her face transformed into a mask of rage. You don't understand, she snarled. None of you understand. These people wanted to die. They came to me broken, hopeless, praying for release. I simply answered their prayers. Emma saw her chance. While Mrs. Kelly was focused on Dr. Webb, she grabbed the vial of poison from the table and moved toward Dorothy, who was still slumped against the wall in the far chamber. But as she passed one of the zinc-lined coffins, a terrible idea occurred to her. She remembered the Epiac bottle, the real one that she had seen earlier among Mrs. Kelly's medical supplies. If she could find it, she might be able to save Dorothy. But first, she had to stop Mrs. Kelly. Mrs. Kelly, she called out, holding up the vial of poison. You're right. I do want to be free from suffering. I want to join your ministry. The older woman stopped her attack on Dr. Webb and turned toward Emma, her expression becoming hopeful and pleased. Do you mean it, child? Do you truly understand what I'm offering you? I do, Emma said, unscrewing the top of the vial. I want to be at peace. I want to stop being afraid. She raised the vial to her lips, and Mrs. Kelly's face filled with religious ecstasy. Yes, dear child, let go of your earthly bonds. Let me help you find your way home. But instead of drinking the poison, Emma suddenly hurled the vial's contents directly into Mrs. Kelly's face. The strychnine burned Mrs. Kelly's eyes and mouth, sending her into convulsions of agony. She clawed at her face, screaming in pain and rage, while Dr. Webb recovered his balance and grabbed the crowbar again. The real Ipecac, Emma shouted to him. Where is it? Dr. Webb struck Mrs. Kelly with the crowbar, sending her crashing to the stone floor, then rushed to the medical supply shelves. Here, he said, tossing Emma a brown bottle. Force her to drink as much as possible. Emma ran to Dorothy, who was barely conscious now, her breathing shallow and irregular. She forced the Ipecac down her sister's throat, then held her as Dorothy's body began to convulse, expelling the drugs that had been slowly killing her. Behind them, Mrs. Kelly was trying to crawl toward the stairs, her face a mass of chemical burns, her voice reduced to unintelligible moans. Dr. Webb followed her, the crowbar raised, ready to strike again if necessary. The police, Emma gasped, still holding Dorothy as her sister vomited. We have to get the police. The door upstairs is still barred, Dr. Webb reminded her, and there's still whoever was helping her. As if summoned by his words, they heard footsteps above them and a man's voice calling down, "Mrs. Kelly, Mrs. Kelly, is everything all right down there?" The voice was weak and confused, not threatening. Emma realized that Mrs. Kelly's accomplice was probably just another drugged victim following her orders without understanding what he was doing. "Mr. Dr. Patterson," Dr. Webb called up the stairs. "This is Dr. Webb. Mrs. Kelly has been poisoning you. You need to open this door and let us help you." There was a long pause, then the sound of the bar being lifted. The door opened to reveal a thin, elderly man with vacant eyes and trembling hands. "Dr. Webb," he said uncertainly. I don't understand," Mrs. Kelly said. "She said you were burglars. She's been drugging you, Mr. Patterson," Dr. Webb said gently, helping the confused man down the stairs. "She's been drugging all of you, but it's over now. You're safe." Emma looked around the basement at the evidence of Mrs. Kelly's crimes, the preserved bodies, the laboratory, the detailed records of theft and murder. 34 people had died in this place, and Dorothy had nearly become the 35th. Mrs. Kelly lay unconscious on the stone floor, her breathing ragged but steady. She would live to face trial for her crimes, though Emma doubted she would ever be truly punished for the magnitude of her evil. The Richmond police arrived at 1247 Marshall Street at dawn on the 16th of February, 1889. Summoned by Dr. Webb's frantic telephone call to the station, what they found in the basement of Mrs. Kelly's boarding house became the most horrific crime scene in Virginia's history. 34 bodies, all perfectly preserved, all arranged with the same religious care that Mrs. Kelly had given to her husband, Patrick's corpse, years earlier. The victims ranged in age from 23 to 71, representing dozens of churches and mission societies across the South. Each had been slowly poisoned over a period of weeks or months, while Mrs. Kelly systematically stole their money, their possessions, and their identities. The investigation revealed the full scope of Mrs. Kelly's operation. She had been corresponding with religious organizations throughout Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, identifying potential victims among traveling ministers, missionaries, and church workers. Her method was always the same: offer Christian hospitality to lonely, isolated people, then gradually drug them into compliance while she looted their estates. The financial records found in her basement showed that she had stolen over $47,000, equivalent to nearly $1 million in today's money. She had forged hundreds of documents, filed false insurance claims, and even collected death benefits on people who were still alive in her basement prison. Dr. Webb's medical examination of the victims revealed that Mrs. Kelly had been experimenting with different combinations of drugs, carefully calibrating dosages to keep her victims alive, but helpless for as long as possible. Some had been drugged for over a year before finally succumbing to organ failure. The discovery sent shock waves through Virginia's religious community. Churches that had recommended Mrs. Kelly's boarding house felt responsible for sending their members to their deaths. Reverend Whitman resigned his position at Clay Street Methodist Church and moved west, unable to bear the guilt of having blessed the house where so many faithful Christians had died. Emma Ashford's sister Dorothy survived, though she required months of medical treatment to recover from the effects of Mrs. Kelly's drugs. The experience left her with permanent memory problems and a deep distrust of religious institutions. She never again set foot in a church. Mrs. Kelly herself was arrested and charged with 34 counts of murder, along with numerous counts of fraud, forgery, and theft. Her trial became a sensation, drawing reporters from across the country who were fascinated by the story of the Christian widow who had become one of America's most prolific serial killers. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderer motivated by greed, but Mrs. Kelly's defense attorney argued that she was genuinely insane, driven by a twisted religious mania that made her believe she was doing God's work. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. Mrs. Kelly was sentenced to death by hanging, but she never lived to face execution. On the night before her scheduled hanging, she was found dead in her cell, apparently having saved enough strychnine from her attack on Emma to poison herself. Her final words, written on a scrap of paper found clutched in her hand, were, "I go now to join my children in paradise." The boarding house at 1247 Marshall Street was demolished by order of the City Council, and the lot remained empty for over 50 years. The Methodist Church purchased the property in 1941 and built a memorial garden with 34 white roses planted in memory of Mrs. Kelly's victims. But the true horror of Mrs. Kelly's crimes lay not just in the number of people she killed, but in the trust she violated. She had used the very foundations of Christian faith, hospitality, charity, and compassion as weapons against the innocent. She had turned a place that should have been a sanctuary into a chamber of death. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of faith-based communities to predators who hide behind religious rhetoric. It demonstrated how easily trust could be manipulated, how quickly charity could become complicity, and how the desire to help others could blind people to obvious warning signs. The investigation also revealed the isolation and loneliness that made Mrs. Kelly's victims such easy targets. Traveling ministers, aging missionaries, and single church workers often had no close family ties, no regular correspondence, no one who would immediately notice if they disappeared. Their very dedication to serving others made them vulnerable to someone who would exploit their trust. In the years following the trial, several similar cases came to light across the country. The Mrs. Kelly case had exposed a pattern of predatory behavior that targeted religious communities, specifically leading to new laws requiring background checks for those operating boarding houses and stricter oversight of financial transactions involving church funds. The Methodist Church in Richmond established new protocols for recommending lodging to traveling clergy, and many other denominations followed suit. The age of unquestioned trust in Christian hospitality was over, replaced by a more cautious approach that recognized the potential for evil to hide behind a facade of piety. Emma Ashford became something of a celebrity after the trial, sought out by newspapers and magazines for her first-hand account of discovering Mrs. Kelly's crimes. But she found no satisfaction in the attention. The memory of what she had seen in that basement haunted her for the rest of her life, and she often wondered how many other Mrs. Kellys might be operating in communities across America, using faith as a weapon against the faithful. Dr. Webb continued his medical practice, but became an advocate for better regulation of boarding houses and stricter controls on the sale of dangerous drugs. He testified before the Virginia legislature about the need for medical oversight of establishments that housed vulnerable populations. The case of Mrs. Kelly's boarding house became a cautionary tale told in churches and seminaries across the country, a reminder that evil could wear the mask of righteousness and that the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared most trustworthy. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors sometimes come not from supernatural forces or unknown monsters, but from the darkness that can lurk in ordinary human hearts. Mrs. Kelly's crimes were made possible not by demonic powers or other worldly forces, but by the very human failings of greed, manipulation, and the abuse of trust. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Mrs. Kelly's methods? Or do you think there were other secrets buried with her? The truth is often more terrifying than fiction, especially when it shows us how thin the line can be between faith and fanaticism, between charity and exploitation. Leave your comment below. Have you ever encountered someone who used religion to mask their true intentions? If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. These dark chapters of American history remind us that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who convince us they're trying to save our souls. See you in the next video.